Hey guys, today's topic is Doctors of Reddit. What was your how the duck did you survive that moment? Let's begin. Not a doctor but paramedic. Once went a car wreck where a drunk drove head first into the corner of a brick bridge at 100 miles per hour, took a huge wedge out of the bottom of the bridge, and left the car about one-fourth of its normal length. All the impact was on the driver's side, turned up only 2 minutes after the crash, and fully expected it to be a fatality. Walked round to the driver's side, and somehow he was fully conscious but squeezed into the only space left in the car. Took almost 3 hours to get him out, and on extracting him out he had absolutely nothing wrong with him other than being a pissed up arsehole. Still think how the duck did he survive that. Emergency nurse. Once had a guy come in who had been cutting a tree with a chainsaw when it hit a knot in the wood and kicked up into his neck. Finished cutting the tree because he knew his wife would make him get rid of the chainsaw. Put a towel on it and drove himself to the hospital. CT showed no vascular damage, simple washout, and home the next day. One of the paramedics who saw him said to his patient, "That's a real emergency. Why don't we ever get those?" Had a neighbor that was in the locking business. He was working alone, stupid, and wasn't wearing chaps. Saw kicked back and went into his thigh, barely missing his femoral artery. When he jerked it away from his leg, he hit the T and somehow broke the chain, which then wrapped itself around his face and neck. Mainly superficial damage there. He tied his leg off and drove himself to the nearest hospital that was over 50 miles away. This was in the 80s, so no cell phones, etc. Just ended up with some gnarly scars. Edit, I'm an idiot and can't spell. Not a doctor, but a friend's story. He'd been feeling like shit for a long time. Went to the doctor. Doctor ordered a bunch of blood tests and ordered them on a rush basis. The lab calls the doctor to bitch him out. Why the fuck did you make us rush this test? Doctor is confused. Lab is like, the guy is clearly dead. So what's the ducking rush? Doctor calls him, tells him to not drive but to get himself to emergency ASAP. Guy was a type 1 diabetic, hadn't realized it until way later in life, and apparently his blood work suggested he was a corpse rather than a living person. He's still doing fine. What? Not a doctor, but a fellow worker, took a 35 herbs steel plate being propelled by 3770 psi, equivalent to 188.5 car tires, to the face. Sent him 15 feet in the air and 40 feet back. Broke every bone in his face, lived, and back to work 8 months later. Not a doctor yet, but I worked in a trauma center as a scribe before starting med school. Basically, I was attached at the hip with a doctor to do their documentation. One guy wrecked his car into a wooden fence, and a wooden fence post went in his mouth and came out of the back of his neck. It was the kind of fence post that was double the size of his mouth. It had basically pushed off all the important anatomy to the side as it impaled him. They were consulting doctors for like 10 different specialties working on this guy in the hospital. Several weeks later, after he fully recovered, he walked back in the emergency department to thank everyone. Wow. Not a doctor yet, but during one of my night shifts as a medical student, I had to take in charge a patient who came to the ER for a car accident. Well, that's quite common. What is not is that he came by himself from 40 kilometers by calling a taxi because his car was absolutely wrecked in the accident. Normally, when your car ends up upside down after 2 or 3 rollovers at 60 km per hour, which the patient did, you are not really fine. However, he was totally okay. No broken bone, no head trauma, no abdominal pain, nothing. He just came to the ER because he had little dermabrasions over his knees and one elbow, and it hurts when it rubs against my clothes. 3 band-aids later, and he was good to go. When I was small, around 4 or 5 maybe, don't remember the date, I got hit by 3 different cars in the span of 1 hour. I wanted to sit with my mom on the front seat and ran to the street from the back seat, got hit by a car and was sent flying by about 20 meters and hit a metal pole. I got up, tried to walk over to my family and got hit by another car. It was near an intersection and the car was driving pretty fast, so they didn't see the accident. At this point in time, my family was freaking out, and all I remember is my mom going to the hospital with me, and the rest is blank until after I leave the hospital. I was fine. After I got out of the hospital, I decided to run for some reason and got hit by another car. I had a concussion and a nosebleed from this ordeal, but completely fine in every other way. Every time I think this question, the answer is usually math. One guy got hit in the face hard enough to let air into his brain cavity and was being an absolute arsehole, which seemed to be normal for him, and literally asked, "Got any meth?" when I offered some pain relief. To my understanding, he recovered without any need for surgery. Dude, meth is a hell of a drug. I've seen people practically invincible on that shit. It's insane. I was a surgical resident in a small town hospital. We got paged to see a patient for a speared piece of driftwood through the leg. We were thinking it was a nicked femoral artery and discussing if this poor kid needed amputation. When we saw him, he was standing on the skewered leg taking a piss. Turns out the wood missed every single one of the vital vessels and no fracture, just muscular damage. I was working in the emergency department when a toddler came in after falling out of a 3-story window completely unharmed. The sad thing was they were from a rough neighborhood and the mum hadn't noticed for about half an hour. Apparently, the friendly apartment pot smokers found him, checked him over and sat with him for half an hour, and when mum didn't show up, went to find her. The child was admitted overnight mostly for social reasons, but it's just amazing how well kids bounce. Early years in medical school, I saw a surgery of a policeman who was shot in head in a gunfight. The bullet went through his skull and brain. With my experience in games and movies, I always assumed a headshot is instant death, but that man survived it, and I was in shock how this can happen. Turns out, in many cases, a headshot can be survived. Sorry for my English is not good. I am not a doctor, but when I around 23, I was stubborn and didn't go to the doctors for feeling weak and numb all the time with some blackouts. I brushed it off until I literally couldn't get up to walk to the bathroom, thinking it was just a cold or flu. When I finally made it to the ER, my blood count was at 3. Regular is around 14. Doctor said he didn't know how I was alive still. Imagine a doctor walking in all confused and being like, "Son, you don't got no blood."